All right. Well, I'm impressed. We started with Job last week, and you guys are back. But there's some great lessons in here, and we're going to learn some more tonight as we continue on in the book. And we got introduced to Job last week, this man from the land of Uz, who was blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. And in his day, as we figured out, probably during the time of the patriarchs, maybe somewhere after Abraham, very possibly a contemporary of Jacob in that generation, but that Job lived during that time and is an example of one that God called to be his son, kind of outside of that Abrahamic promise or covenant, if you will. Could have been that he was a descendant maybe, but either way, sort of outside of that whole line, if you will, from Abraham on, we see this character Job fall in, and he certainly was set apart. He was one of the greatest people of all of the East, as the Lord had blessed him with possessions, with a huge family, 10 kids, 7 sons and 3 daughters, and servants and all that they needed, and kids that loved each other, got together for birthday parties and celebrated and had feasts together. And of course, as you recall, if you were here last week, this conversation then, as the veil is pulled back and the Holy Spirit lets us see a conversation that went on in heaven where Job came up, and God was there, and all of the sons of God, the angels, were presenting themselves before the Lord in rank, and among them was Satan, and God sort of singled him out and said, "Hey, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him on earth, blameless and upright a man he is, one who fears God and shuns evil." But Satan basically calls God on the carpet, if that's even possible, and says, yeah, he does that because you pay him to. You bless him. You give him everything he needs. And so why wouldn't he? Take all of that away and he'll curse you to your face. And God gives him permission to do so, so that the blasphemies or blasphemic phrases of Satan would be hushed in heaven. And then we see that Job was inflicted as one thing after another was stripped from him. His possessions, all that he had, his servants, and then even his kids. But Job stayed upright. He did not curse God. As a matter of fact, his response to the first trial was, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And as we talked about last week, it's one thing to acknowledge that the Lord gives and takes away, and to acknowledge that he's sovereign, but within that sovereignty, to be able to say, "Blessed be your name." That even though I don't understand it, even though I can't comprehend what's going on in my life right now, even though I can't put a finger on why this is happening, and you don't seem to be telling me, Lord, blessed be your name. So we made that discovery as well last week. And then another conversation in heaven where God says, well, do you see Satan? He didn't curse me, now did he? As a matter of fact, you asked me to go after him, and look, he is still upright. He's still fearing me and shunning evil. And then Satan calls in the big guns and says, yeah, well, skin for skin. You touch his body, and guaranteed he will indeed curse you. So God again gives permission, and Satan inflicts Job with a horrendous disease. We're not exactly sure what it was, but it did cause him to have these incredible boils all over his skin from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head. That's significant because, you know, it's one thing to have sores here and there, but if you can still walk around. I don't know if you had chicken pox as a kid. I had a really bad case of them. I think I was 4 or 5 years old, but I still remember it like it was yesterday, mostly because I had them on the bottom of my feet, and trying to walk around on those things was just excruciating for a little guy. I complained a lot. I didn't do as well as Job, that's for sure. My mom heard it quite often. But here's Job, and because of his disease and because he becomes repulsive, he removes himself from society. He places himself there at the refuge heap outside of town where all of the poor and the beggars are waiting for scraps of food, and all the down and outers. And there he sits on the ash heap, and he scrapes his sores. And his wife says to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Why don't you just curse God and die?" She's had enough as well. And Job's response to his second trial is, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So we see this example of Job as he's taken through these horrendous trials. As the team was singing this song tonight, I thought, gosh, how appropriate. This one thing remains. Higher than the mountains that I face, stronger than the power of the grave, constant in the trial and the change, and yet one thing remains. Your love never fails. It never gives up. Never runs out on me. I love that. It just fits like a glove. Well, we left Job there at verse 10 of chapter 2 last week, and we're going to pick it up now as he's there outside of town. His wife has already gone out to give her 2 cents. She's probably went back to their home, wherever that is, and now he sits alone. But Job, being a great man of influence in his day, gained friends along the way. Some, I'm sure, were true friends. Others, probably those that just kind of wanted to rub shoulders with somebody rich, someone who was probably known as one of the greatest people in that area. There in Uz, as we discovered last week, probably somewhere in the area of Edom, down in the southern part of the Negev, the desert there. But this is going to be the time when the true friends are separated from those hobnobbers. And he did have 3 true friends. So in verse 11, we read, "Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this adversity that had come upon him, each one came from his own place. Eliphaz the Timnite, Bildad the Shuhite." He's the shortest person in the Bible, by the way, because he's a Shuhite. Just in case you never discovered that, I want to bring these nuggets as they come. Never mind. "And Zophar the Naamathite, for they made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. And when they raised their eyes from afar and did not recognize him." So this is what the condition that Job was in. His friends, his good friends, the ones that got together and said, "We need to go see him," didn't even recognize him. And verse 12 goes on, "They lifted their voice and wept. Each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. So they sat down with him on the ground in the trash heap 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great." So we're introduced now for the first time to these 3 friends of Job. And I know that these guys are going to get a pretty rough commentary through the rest of this book, and we'll probably join right in tearing a lot of their theology apart, because not much of it is sound. However, before we do that, let's take a moment and ask this question. When it comes to crisis, when it comes to people in our lives that are suffering, what kind of friend are we? We need to ask that. Because there's that natural tendency at times when people are really going through it, when there's really hardship in their lives, when there are things that we really don't understand, there is sometimes that natural tendency to draw away, to pull away from those people, to not want to have to face the reality, to feel someone in our hearts justified, because after all, we don't want to rub it in their face. We don't want to have to make them explain to us again and again what's going on and what's wrong. And combined with our own discomfort, we have this tendency to kind of keep our distance from those folks when they need us the most. So what kind of friend are we? Are we like these 3 guys who They are from 3 different places throughout this region, throughout this area. And yet when the buzz started going throughout all of this area of Edom and around Uz and these neighboring towns of what had happened to Job, can you imagine? Can you imagine the buzz? Can you imagine even sometimes the gossip may have already started? What happened in that household? Somebody must have done something really wrong, because it looks like the gods, or God, is angry with them. And these 3 guys hear all of the chatter that's going on around town about the tragedy that has come upon Job and his household and his kids. All 10 of them, they all knew them. They were all well known in town. And all of these kids suddenly, within an instant, they're gone. What now? Well, they come together. They find each other, I don't know, by messenger, say, hey, we need to do something here. And once the 3 of them get together, by appointment, it says, they decide that they're going to go see Job with the objective to comfort him. They have no idea what to expect. They have no idea what's going to happen. But their thought is, let's go and be with our brother as he's mourning. And can you imagine, they get into town and they go to the house. And all they find there is his wife. Where's Job? We're here to spend some time with him. We've heard of what has happened. We don't want to keep our distance. We want to be active in this. We want to be good friends. Where is he? His wife simply points to the outside of town. There at the refuge heap. You'll find him. Okay. And they went out expecting to see Job in his regular form, in his beautiful robes, that regal, long flowing hair that he had, and full beard. And yet as they're looking around, people, they're there kind of scrounging through the garbage, and there on the top of the heap sits this person. Who is that? Well, that's Job. No, that's not Job. Yes, that's Job. Oh my goodness. They couldn't believe it. They were awestruck to such a degree that even before they got to him, they lifted their voices, they wailed, they wept for their friend. They were brokenhearted for him. Then each one of them, in that show of solidarity, tears his own robe, as if to say, Job, your pain is my pain. I'm going to sit here with you. They put dust on their heads so that they too would be unrecognizable to the world around them as Job was. They identified with him step for step. And then they did an interesting thing. They sit down on the ground with him, and for 7 days and 7 nights sat in absolute silence, because they could sense how deep his grief was. You know, sometimes the best way to help people who are hurting is just simply to be with them. Don't try to come up with explanations, because explanations very rarely heal a broken heart. What people really want is just for you to be there. I remember hearing from Greg Laurie when he had lost his son a few years back already. And Stephen Curtis Chapman, who had also gone through quite a bit of tragedy in his life, is a good friend of Greg's, and they finally got together months probably afterwards, but still for Greg when the hurt was still so raw. And they finally came face to face, and Greg relays a story that Stephen Curtis Chapman came up and he said something that was so helpful. He said, Greg, there are no words. That's all he said. And that was the most helpful thing he had heard. Because here was a man that identified with what he had gone through, and there was no reason to try to explain it or have some sort of, curt fix-all to it. There are no words. So let me sit here with you in your pain. Let's go through it together. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time with these 3 guys, so just briefly, I want to introduce you to them. First is Eliphaz the Timnite. Now, he's a descendant of Esau. His name means, Eliphaz, my God is gold. And he's from this place, Timnah, which is known for its wisdom. As a matter of fact, in Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 7, it says, against Edom, and thus says the Lord of hosts, is wisdom no more in Tinma? In other words, it was a place that was known, well known for its wisdom. Has counsel perished from the prudent? Has their wisdom vanished? So he was from a place that had a reputation for its wisdom. And yet Eliphaz bases his speeches to Job on two things. One, his own observations of life, not necessarily God's sovereignty. And two, the frightening personal experience he had one night. We don't know exactly what it is. We'll learn a bit more of it as we go through. But Eliphaz put great faith in tradition, and that the God he worshiped was this inflexible lawgiver. And that's who he conveyed to Job. Eliphaz had a rigid theology that left little or no room for the grace of God. As a matter of fact, later on in chapter 4, verse 7 of Job, here's a statement that he makes. Remember now, whoever perishes being innocent, or where were the upright ever cut off? In other words, saying if you do everything perfect, if you do everything according to the law, then everything in your life will be just where it needs to be. That was Eliphaz. Then the next one is the short guy, Bildad the Shuhite. His name means confusing love or mingled love. Not sure if that has any significance. It is interesting, though, that him being a Shuhite, it may suggest that he had relationship to Shua, who was the youngest son of Abraham. Abraham's youngest son. Now, in a word, Bildad was a legalist, and we'll discover that as we go. Bildad was sure that Job's children died because they were also sinners. Later on in chapter 8, verse 20, it says, he makes this statement, behold, God will not cast away the blameless, nor will he uphold the evildoer. Again, that legalism. You got to do everything right, fly straight, be good, and everything will come as it may. It will fall into place where it's supposed to. But if you're an evildoer, then woe is you. And then finally Zophar, the Namathite. His name means sparrow. There may be significance there. He speaks like a schoolmaster addressing a group of ignorant students throughout the rest of the book. He's merciless, as a matter of fact, and he even tells Job that God is giving him far less than he deserves for his sin. So now, I know you have a different view of these three friends, but for the moment, at least, they're sitting quietly with Job in appropriate silence. Well, that silence after 7 days is broken. Fortunately, it's broken by Job himself. And in chapter 3, we have his words. And as we go through these, as we go through Job's lament, if you want to call it that, remember how deep his hurt is. Remember how much he is in pain here and suffering within. Not only physically in his body, but emotionally and mentally as he's grieving this great loss of everything that he knows. Not just his kids, just really everything that he knows. And as he has sat there for 7 days, weeping, mourning, robes torn, dirt on his face, friends sitting around him in silence, maybe at times them just staring at him, wondering, is he going to say anything? Feeling the pressure of that. Am I supposed to say something? Am I supposed to be the one that breaks the silence? Well, finally he does after the 7 days. But Job's going to do an interesting thing in this chapter. He's going to begin to draw himself closer and closer to the sovereignty of God. And he does so in 3 stages. Verses 1 through 10 is one stage, 11 through 19 is another, and then 20 through 26 is the third. So we'll look at all 3 of those. But what's interesting is that Job begins kind of outside of God's sovereignty, and then he works himself in step by step more and more towards that sovereignty. And you know how he gets it? He gets it by stepping back and gaining more and more of the big picture. Now, I don't know if God always works this way in all of our lives, but I can tell you, for me personally, that is one thing that got me through a lot of the pain and the grieving that I experienced when I lost my first wife. Because she was only 26, and really, by all intents and purposes, it didn't make any sense to take someone that young, who had just birthed a child, who was the most amazing mama. She doted on that little one. As a matter of fact, Tara, our daughter, was a preemie. She was only 2 pounds 5 ounces when she was born. So she was a dinky kid most of her first year. And my wife had this habit of, usually you kind of carry a baby at the extension of your arm. But she didn't. She always had her up like right here so that they were face to face. Because she was so small, if she had her down here, she would always be looking down at her. But she always carried her this way. It almost looked awkward at times as she's walking through the grocery store getting stuff, and she's got this little baby like sitting up here, But I realized it was so that they could be face to face. She was a wonderful mom. Why take that away from this little girl? And I remember so distinctly one night as I was praying and spending time with the Lord and just wondering, how am I going to go on? What am I going to do next? Lord, speak to me. I need to get past, in a sense, my own grief so I can be there for my daughter. I know we'll grieve together, but I need to be strong for her. And what God used to get me past that point was, in a sense, He took me and He backed me completely away from the situation. And He gave me the big picture for a moment. And it came like this. You see, Gerard, I have this daughter. She's only going to live 26 years. In her 20th year, she's going to come to know me. She'll walk with me for 6 years. But she has two desires deep within her heart ever since she was young, a little girl. And that is that she would want to be a wife and she wanted to be a mother. But her life will only last 26 years. Those are the days that are written for her in my book. So I need someone that is willing to fulfill those two things in her life before I take her home. Will you be that person? When I heard that from the Lord, I found myself once again saying, now I get it. Yes, Lord, of course. I wouldn't have traded a moment, a second of our time together or having this wonderful little girl as a result of that union. You see, He gave me the big picture. Job is going to gain the big picture step by step. But he begins, in a sense, by cursing the day of his birth. Let's go to verse 1 together. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job spoke and said, may the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which it was said, a male child is conceived. Notice he doesn't curse God here. As a matter of fact, he really doesn't bring God into any of it. He's just looking at the day that he's born. As there's been these 7 days of silence and Job decides he's going to say something, he thinks to himself, how can I get relief from this? How could I possibly get out from under all of this pain? And the only comfort that he can find in that moment within his own heart is to think, gosh, if I just had never been born. If the day of my birth, that day, not only of my birth, but he goes even a step further back at the end of verse 3 there, the day that a male child was conceived. If that had not happened, if that day could have somehow been wiped off the calendar, never have existed. It went just from day 6 to day 8. That 7 that was in there, that day I was born, just never happened. Then maybe some of this pain that I'm experiencing now would not be coursing through my veins. He even curses, like I said, the night of his conception. By the way, there are some great proof texts throughout this passage, and this is one of them. In terms of when life begins. Because what is Job saying? He's not cursing the day that he was born into this world. He's cursing the day he was conceived. Because when does life begin, brothers and sisters? The first cell division. Right? The very first cell division. That's when life begins. At conception. Job realized it, and he wished that even that day could have been wiped away. Then he wishes he had never even seen the light of day. Look at verse 4. May that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor the light shine upon it. May darkness and the shadow of death claim it. May a cloud settle on it. May the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, may darkness seize it. May it not rejoice among the days of the year. May it not come into the number of the months. Are you sensing a little bit of Job's pain here? This is very poetic, and it really in a lot of ways shows just the inner workings of his heart. Notice just within these last 3 verses we read how many times he uses the word dark or darkness or a reference to it. Darkness, he calls it. Shadow of death. Clouds that over, and even the blackness of day. What causes blackness during the day? Something tragic, right? Like a tornado or a dust storm. That's the only way the sun's blocked out. So he's even saying, in those times, may even that darkness. Why? Because he wants that little infant, that little baby that's being formed there in the womb, of which he wished had never happened, never to see the light of day, never to break out into that light. Because what does a little baby do for 9 months? They're in darkness, aren't they? They're in that warm place of the mother's womb as they develop and are nourished through the umbilical cord. And it's dark and it's peaceful and it's quiet. And it gets jogged around a little bit now and then. And they even do their best to kick back and move. But I don't think any of us can remember, fortunately, the trauma of suddenly bursting into light. And the way we do it in our culture, you're birthed in a room that's like super lit, so they can see everything that's going on. And from this quiet, peaceful, dark place, suddenly you're cast into this tremendous light. Job wishes that that day had never happened. And even there in verse 6, that the night may, for that night may darkness seize it. He's talking again about his conception, that night that he was conceived. May it not rejoice among the day of the year. May it not come into the number of the months. Wipe it again, Lord, from the calendar, both days, nights, months. Take them away. Then he calls for barrenness. Verse 7, oh, that it might be barren. May no joyful shout come into it. That word barren there means stony. Or in other words, that his mother would have been barren and unproductive as a stony ground. When the farmer goes to sow his seed, when it falls on that stony ground, seed doesn't go into dirt. It never produces. It never germinates. It's what that barrenness that he's talking about. His pain, again, just amplified. Verse 8, may those curse it who curse the day, those who are ready to rouse Leviathan. Now, this is an interesting thing, and we'll talk a little bit more about Leviathan later in the book. But what Job is referring to here, may those curse who curse the day, and those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. Now, there was a tradition or a legend in Job's day that there were these sorcerers that had the ability, it was mythology for the most part, the ability to rouse this dragon that lived in the sea. And when they aroused it, it was unfortunate that they had this ability to have the dragon swallow the sun or the moon, to bring darkness. And that's what Job is referring to here. Those who curse the day, those who are ready to arouse Leviathan, to bring this darkness upon everybody around. Verse 9 and 10, may the stars of its morning be dark. May it look for light, but have none. Not see the dawning of the day, because it did not shut up the door of my mother's womb, nor hide sorrow from my eyes. Job was looking for darkness because usually darkness hides objects, right? When it's dark, you can't see. You ever have your kids rearrange the furniture during the day, and then you get up early in the morning, figure, I'm not going to disturb the family. I know this house like the back of my hand. I'm just going to walk around in the dark. But guess what? The back of your hand isn't what hits that furniture or that whatever it is, that piece of Lego or Duplo that's left on the floor. It's your foot. Suddenly you find yourself screaming. Now you have woken the entire household. It would have been better to just turn on the lights. Yeah, it does kind of hide things, darkness. And that's what Job was hoping for. But you know what? In spite of the darkness, that womb was still opened. Again, a great reference to conception there, not birth. He would not be hidden from the sorrow he now experienced. So Job's first attempt at comforting himself in crying out this lament was to go all the way back to the moment of his conception and just hoping that he had never, ever been born. Because if that had happened, he wouldn't be experiencing this now. He wouldn't be grieving his kids. And again, for those of us that have experienced this kind of pain and hurt, or maybe you're in the middle of it right now, listen to Job's heart. Let him walk you through step by step, because the next step he gets just a little bit closer. He realizes that, okay, wishing that the day of his birth never happened is fruitless, because it did. Why? Because God is sovereign. Because God chose to have that happen. But then what do? I'm still here. I'm still in pain. I'm still sitting here on this heap of ashes with these three guys staring at me, wondering what I'm going to say next. The pain hasn't gone away. What can I comfort myself with now? So he goes a little step further, but yet closer to God's sovereignty, and says basically this in the next section: well, I wish that if I had been born, at least I had been born dead, that I would not have even seen my first breath on the day of my birth. Verse 11. Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb? Why did the knees receive me, or why the breasts that I should nurse? Do you notice that Job asks why 4 different times in just these 2 verses? Why? Why not die? Why not perish? Why did the knees receive me? Now, that's a reference to a practice that happened in the days of the patriarchs, where when a baby was born, a baby comes from the mother's womb, right? Well, the father, who is the patriarch of the family, and the one that the inheritance through him to, especially that son, if it was a boy, which Job was, would be passed on. The baby was then, when it was born, symbolically put on the father's knees, on his lap, as if to say, this is now your legacy. This is your inheritance, this young child. You are as much a part of this as the mother, the woman who birthed him. So that was the practice in those days, and Job is even saying, why? Why was I not dead? Because if a baby was stillborn, he would not be put on his father's knees. He would just quietly be taken away and buried and mourned for. So why? 4 times. You know, why, as we talked about last week, is a question that nobody but God can answer. Correct? And we even mentioned last week, if you ask why, don't fret, because you're in good company. Job's asking why. Jesus himself asked why on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? See, Jesus, though, when he asked that, didn't expect an answer. He really knew what it was. But in his humanity, he asked it anyway. But go with me on this for a moment. If you're hurting like Job is, and you ask God why, who is the only one that can answer it, if God answered your question, would that take the pain away? It wouldn't, would it? Not really. So why ask why? I mean, look at it this way. You've got a broken leg. Those hurt. Now the doctor is putting your x-ray up on the screen there and shows you exactly what has happened. You now know Why? Does it take the pain away? You can have that x-ray in your mind. You can meditate. You can om on that x-ray. It's not going to take the pain away. So even if God were to answer those questions, why? It doesn't change the circumstance necessarily and doesn't really take away the pain. So better for us not to ask the Lord why, but simply to say, your will be done, Lord. Help me to trust. Help me to move further in your grace and mercy. He's the only one. We as Christians live on promises, not on explanations. Because the fact of the matter is, God doesn't owe us one, ever. And when he gives them to us, however he chooses to do so, it's for a very specific purpose, and it's to get us further down the road. But usually, when we ask why, God returns us or replies us with a question. And what is that question usually? Do you trust me? Right? Do you trust me? If I'm God, if I'm sovereign, if I'm the Lord of all, if I have everything in control, if I have your best in mind, if you have read my word enough to know that I have great plans for you, a future and a hope, not thoughts of evil, then do you trust me? Job goes on in verse 13, for now I would have lain still and been quiet. If I'd have been dead when I was born, then now there would have been stillness and quiet. I would have been asleep, and then I would have been at rest. 4 conditions of his view of death here: to lay still, to be quiet, to fall asleep, to be at rest. All places of peace that he would have known if he had died at birth. You see, we're getting a little perspective of what Job believed about death. He did believe it was a peaceful place. He did believe there was rest there. He didn't fully understand, like we do, what awaits us after death, the view of heaven that we have because of the finished work of Jesus Christ. So Job was a little more limited in his view, and so because of it, he thought, gosh, yeah, I was born and that was God's sovereign will, but if only I could have been dead when I was born, then all of this time that I spent raising my kids, having them, raising them, loving them, spending time with them, rather I would have been at peace and asleep somewhere, at rest, lying there. Although, you know, heaven isn't always necessarily that peaceful. Like the guy, good old George, who woke up in the middle of the night in a sweat, screaming. And his wife says, what's wrong, honey? What's wrong? And he says, well, I just had a dream that I went to heaven. And she goes, and it was so bad up there that's why you wake up in this cold sweat? And he goes, well, yeah, because I got up to heaven and I was right there with God face to face, and he sneezed. And I had no idea what to say to him. It was horrific. You'll get it on the way home. I don't know. Why do I even? Never mind. For Job, he was looking forward to that peaceful rest. And not only that, but he figured he'd be in good company. Look at verse 14. With kings and counselors of the earth who built ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Altogether, he would be in good company. But again, the wise come in verse 16. Or why was I not hidden like a stillborn child, like infants who never saw light? Again, the why of Job rings out, seeking solace in the thought of being stillborn. But verse 17, looking again at the grave, at Sheol, at that place where people go when they die, there the wicked cease from troubling. And there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners rest together. And they do not hear the voice of their oppressors. And the small and the great are there, and the servants are free from their masters. See, compared to this pain, compared to the way Job's life has ended up in this moment, as he's facing these tragedies, he's thinking, if he could have been stillborn, then he would have been there already. He already would have been in that place of peace, but where the playing field is level, where everyone's on the same page. Great and poor alike. Famous and those that were never known. The prisoners, they're together. They're oppressors, never bothering them again. Slaves not having to answer to their masters anymore because it's a place of peace. The restful condition of the dead compared to the restless condition of those that are living who suffer. Job's hurt was running very, very deep. Well, Job comes to another realization. And now he thinks and gains a little bit more of that big picture. I can almost see God just kind of backing him up step for step away from the circumstance itself to be able to see a little more clear. Oh, that day of my birth, curse it that it would never happen. Well, it did, and God had me born. Well, at least when I was born, if I could have died right there, I would now be at rest in the grave. But God backs him up a little bit further. And so now Job says, well, then it's better if I die now. I can't take away God's sovereignty from him up to this point. He has chosen to have me here. He has chosen to take me through these things. Naked I came into this world. Naked I will return. The Lord has given and the Lord will take away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Should we receive only good things from the Lord and not adversity also? All of those things ringing through Job's mind. This is the God that I serve. He's got to know what he's doing. But maybe he can show mercy and just take me now. Take me now. Verse 20. Why is the light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter of soul? Who long for death, but it does not come, and search for it more than hidden treasures? Who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they can find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, and whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes before I eat, and my groanings pour out like water. Job, backing a little bit further away, realizing God's hand and his sovereignty, now tries to comfort himself with the possibility that maybe life will be over soon. He's not going to curse God, which was his wife's solution. Go ahead and curse God, and then maybe you will just die. It'll all be over with. He's not going to do that. But at the very least, he could hope, let this be the end. Let it stop right here. If God truly knows what's coming in our lives, and that involves misery, then why should he give that person light and life? Verse 20, the life to a bitter soul. God, if you're sovereign, if you saw this coming, if you knew this from the foundations of the earth, isn't that the God that we believe in? Isn't that the God that we serve? He knows everything that's coming. There's no secrets. God sees the future clearer than we see the past. It's all the same to him. So Lord, if you knew this, why? Why give light to such a person that's going to be in misery, that's going to have a bitter soul? To the point where they will sit here like I am now, Job is saying, longing for death, and yet it doesn't come. Longing for death, and it does not come. Job's not alone in that, is he? We do that. We may not say, oh Lord, I wish that I would die, but we use the rapture, right? Is that? Oh gosh, Jesus could come right now, it'd be great. If he could get here before Gerard's sermon is done, that would be even better. Take that however you want, but be careful how you respond. Right? We say that. But isn't it interesting how things change when something great is coming? When there's a kid on the way? Maybe one of your own or a grandkid that's coming? Oh, Lord, just wait until that little one's born. I'd love to see. Or maybe someone's going to get married. I would love to walk my daughter down the aisle. If you could just wait. You know, when something wonderful is right around the corner. Lord, oh, you can take your time. No, really. But then when the bottom drops out again, And we're sitting there on the heap along with Job going, why, Lord? Why? Why? You could come right now, Jesus. That'd be wonderful. I'm ready. And yet he doesn't. He's patient. He's long-suffering. He waits. He wants more to be added to the kingdom. He wants the numbering of the Gentiles to be full. And if you're sitting here tonight as that last Gentile, get saved tonight, please, because we're ready to go. Job asked, why is this, Lord? That if you could see what's coming, and that those would long for death. And besides, when that comes, verse 22, they rejoice and are exceedingly glad because they have finally found the grave. It's right there. They found the grave. Unlike that gentleman who was a bagpipe player there in Oklahoma. And he had been called by the mortuary if he could go and play Amazing Grace at the graveside of this gentleman that had died, really had no family. Nobody knew him, but thought it would be a respectful thing if they could at least do something. So the mortuary paid him in advance to go out and play Amazing Grace at the graveside. Well, unfortunately, the guy got terribly lost and spent about an hour trying to look for the place. And finally, he pulls up, and there he sees the guys digging. It looks like they're filling the grave in at this point, and goes, oh gosh, I'm really too late. But he thought, you know what, out of respect. So he goes out of his car, gets his bagpipes out of the trunk, and walks over a little bit a ways from where the guys are filling the hole in, and he begins to play Amazing Grace. Just gives it his all. And the guys put their shovels down and in silence kind of bow their heads. One guy even kind of shedding a little bit of a tear. One of the grave diggers. The guy figures, well, I guess I've done my job, and he goes back to his car, and as he's closing the trunk, one of the guys is there that was filling in the hole, and he's saying, I've never seen anything like that. And the guy goes, well, thank you. I thought it would be out of respect. And the man said, yeah, you know, I've been digging cesspools for 30 years. That's the first time I have ever heard anything like that. So finding the grave, not always easy to do. Why is light given to a man, verse 23, whose ways are hidden and whom God has hedged in? Basically, Job is saying, I can't find my way. But this being hedged in is not a hedge of protection. This is a hedge that's so high, I can't find the path. And later on, Job is going to talk about, I believe in chapter 23, about wanting so desperately to find God. Where is he? I can't find him. I don't know where he's gone, but he knows where I'm going. He knows my way. And he's going to try me and test me, and when he has done so, I will come forth as gold. Job realizes. He sees it. But right now, he's feeling like he doesn't know which end is up. He finds himself bewildered. He can't find the path that's visible before him. He's been restricted and hedged in for any hope of his future. He's limited with freedom, the freedom of his movement. His pain was so frequent, like verse 24 says, the sighing comes before I eat, and my groanings pour out like water, that it was as regular as his daily meals or as running water. What Job is saying here is there's not a moment. Even these last 7 days, as I've had these friends here to sit with me and comfort me, as they've joined me in identity in my sorrow, I'm so grateful for that. But the pain hasn't subsided for a second, not for a moment. In the last two verses, Job shares a little secret. In his lament, as he's breaking the silence, as he has cursed the day of his birth, then hoped that when he was born he had died, and now again realizing God's sovereignty, that he wishes he could die now, but death is not coming. He says in verse 25, for the thing I greatly feared has come upon me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet, for I have no rest, for trouble comes. See, he lets us in on a little bit. Job had a feeling, actually he had a fear, that something was coming. And we don't know if this was God giving him intuition, prepping him, the Lord kind of speaking to Job's heart. Satan's been released on your life. Kind of like what Jesus said to Peter, huh? Peter, Simon, Simon, Satan has called you and asked for you by name because he wants to sift you like wheat. Be encouraged. I've prayed for you. I've interceded for you. Did God give Job a warning? Or was he just anxious and worried? Well, if he was an upright man who feared God and shunned evil, it's not likely that that's the case. But perhaps the Lord did kind of give him a sense. He was a broken man whose worst fears had just now been realized. He's saying here, the very thing I greatly feared has come upon me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. If Job was someone that walked around in a lot of anxiety, that would have been a problem. And as a matter of fact, I'd like to close with this thought. I'd like all of us to do a quick little inventory of our own hearts and ask yourself this: am I a person who projects ahead? If I'm a child of God and I know He holds the future, if I know that His will be done in my life, am I someone who projects ahead, especially when I'm uncertain about the things that are coming, when I'm uncertain about the road that's before me, and yet there are some things looming out there that I'm not sure about? Maybe there's a word from the doctor that I'm waiting for, or even some medical tests that I need to engage in to find out some things. Are you projecting ahead? If you're doing that, guess what? You're on your own. Because God only gives the grace and the strength when it's required, in that moment, not a second earlier. I love the story of Corrie ten Boom when she was a young gal. This is way before the war even hit. And she, for some odd reason, decided to read Fox's Book of Martyrs. What a book for young gals to read. But this was her heart. She wanted to read it. And one night she had read about some of the greats of the early church that had been martyred, that had given their lives. And her dad came to tuck her in. And she was weeping. She said, "Papa, I don't think I could do it." And he says, "What, Corrie? What are you afraid of?" And she says, "If God asked me to be a martyr, I don't know that I would have the strength to do it." And her father wisely said, "Corrie, when you and I take our clocks," and he was a watchmaker, a clockmaker, "when we take our clocks on the train from Amsterdam to Rotterdam, when do I give you your ticket?" She said, "Well, you give it to me just before I get on the train." He said, "You know why I do that?" She said, "Well, probably because I might lose it if you give it to me earlier." He says, "Exactly. God will give you the strength only when you need it, if He calls you to be that martyr. And He'll give you all the grace you need." If we're ones that have the habit of projecting ahead, I would advise you stop. Because you're in the flesh. You're being like Job. You're dreading the very thing that's coming upon you. Greatly, greatly troubled. Let God handle it. He's got it. Let Him give you the strength when the strength is required. Because it won't come a moment sooner. And then you can walk through that situation with Him in His strength. Well, Job's cry was a cry of despair, not a cry of defiance. Because it's just that when hurt runs that deep, you cry out. Lord Jesus, thank you. Thank you for your love for us that runs deeper than any of our pain. As it was said, as a matter of fact, by Corrie ten Boom's sister, Betsy, there is no pit so deep that Jesus is not deeper still. And as we've looked tonight at Job's lament, his cry out, and seen him walking through an awareness of your sovereignty, getting pulled back and gaining more and more of the big picture. We'll know by the end of this book that Job will be able to conclude, blessed be the name of the Lord. He gives and he takes away. And so, Lord, as we have sat here humbly with Job, I just pray if there are any here tonight that are hurting, that are uncertain. Maybe there's things in your life where you found yourself projecting ahead, beginning to get anxious, beginning to worry about it, what's going to happen next. I know it's really easy for me to say from here, but I need to say it because it's the truth. Lay that at Jesus' feet. Let him take care of it. Trust him for what is coming. He knows exactly what needs to happen. Let your life rest in his arms, in the peace that passes understanding, as you make your requests known to him, bringing your supplications to him with prayer and thanksgiving in your heart. Give it to him. If you want some prayer tonight, some encouragement, don't hesitate. Come up and pray with one of the guys up front here. They would love to pray with you. Pray for each other. Grab somebody near you and say, hey, can we take a couple minutes and pray together? Lift each other up before we head into this week. God will hear you. He'll put his hand upon your life, and he'll see you through whatever it is you're facing. May we walk in his strength and trust him the whole way. In Jesus' name. Let's all stand.